Neil Cabe is on the line. He is the conservative commentator, editor of the Guns and Patriots newsletter, gunsandpatriots.com, and a fellow with whom, at least on this program, more often than not, we are yelling at each other about guns or some other conservative issue. Neil, welcome back.
Great to be with you, Tom.
And, we've got, because Neil can't figure out how to get in here by Skype, we've got is that picture of Neil, is that from one of the Muppets characters? Or is it just a stick figure? No? Anyway, Neil, great to have you with us.
It's another Hartmann ambush.
No, it's actually a real picture of you from when you're on the TV show.
Super.
You wrote a piece over at Human Events. Actually, you wrote two of them. Human Events, a conservative magazine and online site of some considerable consequence, arguing that Sheldon Adelson, basically a month or so ago when he said, come out to Las Vegas and kiss my ring, and all the Republican candidates went out there, and one of them, I forget who it wasn't Marco Rubio, but one of them used the wrong word in relation to Israel, and who was it? Chris Christie. That's right.
Christie
was falling all over himself to apologize and say, oops, I'm sorry, please don't kick me again, mister. That this, and you're quoting Jack Abramoff here, that this is corruption. You want to riff on that a little bit here?
Well, yeah, for those of you who don't know, Sheldon Adelson is sort of a small Republican version of what George Soros has been doing for the left for many years. He was a major contributor to Newt Gingrich's campaign in 2012. In fact, when Speaker Gingrich's campaign was on the ropes, it was Adelson basically said, I will write the check to keep him in the race.
Right.
Later, he supported Mitt Romney.
Well, and there was a brief period of time there where he supported Rick Santorum, and he actually said, I'm going to make an investment in Santorum. And we did a daily take on that, saying, wait a minute, you're investing in politicians? Investment implies an expected return.
Yeah, that was maybe an unfortunate or prescient turn of a phrase, because what basically happened is after the elections were all over, Adelson went to the Republican Party and said, I want you to outlaw my online competition. He is the CEO of Las Vegas Sands, right, which is a gambling conglomerate that takes in $14 billion in revenues across the world. And, he wants online gambling outlawed in the United States, and right, he has said he will write whatever check he has to write to get it done. And by doing it through the federal government, it basically takes away a state's right to regulate gambling inside its borders. And so you have sort of state rights or federalist politicians like Rick Perry from Texas, who was all about Texas's right to be a sovereign state until Adelson came a knocking, and now Rick Perry is one of the biggest supporters of the sort of front group called Coalition to Stop Internet Gambling.
Right. And so whether it's George Soros corrupting our politics by supporting politicians who want to raise George Soros's taxes, or whether it's Sheldon Adelson corrupting our political system by supporting politicians who want to do away with Sheldon Adelson's competition and lower Adelson's taxes, it's still corruption of the political system. And you can track all this back, up until 1976 in the United States, we considered the regulation, the spending of money for political purposes to be a behavior. And it's been regulated in a whole variety of ways. Probably the peak of that was 1907, the Tillman Act, which made it a federal felony for any corporation or anybody on behalf of a corporation, including lawyers or lobbyists, to give money to any candidate for federal office. That the Tillman Act was struck down by Citizens United more than 3 years later. And the Tillman Act had several errors as well. But it was in 1976 that Lewis Powell wrote for the majority on the Supreme Court, basically an idea that he had been championing in 1971 when he wrote his memo to Eugene Sindor, his neighbor, the head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that somehow magically in the First Amendment he found the word money, that spending money was not a behavior and therefore could be regulated, as was done in 1974 by Congress and signed by Jerry Ford, in the wake of the Watergate scandals. this decision did in Buckley versus Vallejo is it rolled back part of those 1974 campaign finance reforms, and the Supreme Court said, no, spending money is actually the same thing as speech under the First Amendment. And we had never interpreted it that way in the history of America. No other fully developed democracy in the world does. And no Congress had ever voted to say that, and no president had ever voted to say that. And yet the Supreme Court created this law.
With the extreme liberal bias that we have in the mainstream media, the only way a conservative can break through many times is by buying an ad and buying time on air. I mean, so how else is somebody with, say, a minority opinion supposed to break through? I mean, Madison said in the Federalist Papers that this is a commercial republic, and that it was, if one man's dollar is worth another man's dollar, then that's equality. I mean, so in the DNA of this country is the idea that money and
Madison spoke at some length about the danger of incorporated entities. I mean, he was speaking largely of churches, but of their political power, of banding together to use that political power. But as I said, Madison never suggested that spending money was protected by the Constitution.
Well, he did say that because we all of our dollars are equal, that you can pass laws against avarice, but the difficulty is that avarice will always be there, and that restricting freedom is much more of a danger than trying to control.
So are you talking out of two sides of your mouth here, Neil? On the one hand,
no, but what I'm saying, this is what I'm going to say, though. I don't want to get into Maurice Stans and the Watergate fundraising. What I want to talk about is that conservatives, we have to understand that a lot of times people are there are people that we're putting our faith in as leaders, guys like Rick Perry, who have always supported a federalist sort of 10th Amendment view of the Constitution, who are all of a sudden saying, hey, if this guy says, outlaw my competition, and then they go ahead and do it. I mean, Lindsey Graham sponsored the bill in the Senate.
Right.
There's a lot of people who believe that Lindsey Graham is a free market conservative. It's not being a free market conservative when someone who supports you financially asks you to outlaw his competition.
Right. So when a billionaire says jump,
Adam Smith,
a lot of these politicians are saying how high. And so shouldn't we amend the Constitution, because this is the only way to get around the Supreme Court? Again, no president has ever argued that spending money should be that it is constitutionally protected. No Congress has ever asserted this. In fact, to the opposite, Congress has literally hundreds of times since the 18th century, since the 1700s, Congress has asserted that spending money is not constitutionally protected. I mean,
if the current campaign laws applied in 1968, there was no Eugene McCarthy campaign. And frankly, the family that owns Stonyfield Yogurt, I mean, they carried Howard Dean's campaign on their back. I mean, you wouldn't argue that Eugene McCarthy...
That's no way to run a republic, Neil.
But if you have a free press and you have outlets like the Thom Hartmann Show,
well, then let's use the Sherman Act and break. I mean, we now have five media corporations that control 80% of all the media that Americans consume: magazines, newspapers, television, websites, everything. 5 companies, actually 6 companies.
But we know that that'll be broken up. It's like things can decentralize, decentralize. I mean, that's a very common.
It'll be broken up if we decide to enforce the Sherman Act.
Well, I mean, you can also just let the free market do it, because the bankers...
There is no free market. You've got 5 companies. That's a monopoly.
The bankers who made all those businesses merging everything, well, then they're going to make bonuses breaking things up, and spin-offs is just as popular, and you get as many fees breaking things up.
Wouldn't that be nice?
I think that the problem is that you don't want to have businessmen having Congress outlaw their competition. That is the free market problem.
I don't want that. I don't want unions to do it. I don't want George Soros I don't want anybody to be able to buy candidates. That's what I'm saying. Neil McCabe, gunsandpatriots.com. Hang on just a second, Neil.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Gunsandpatriots.com. Neil, thanks for dropping by today.
Hey, great to be with you, Tom.
Good talking with you.